I'd like to take the opportunity now to welcome Emma McClendon, who's the curatorial assistant at the Museum of Fashion Institute of Technology. She's also done her MA in History of Clothing at Cordwainers in London. She's going to be speaking to us about the fashion and technology at MFIT, exploring 250 years of forward-thinking fashion design. This is an exhibition that she co-curated at FIT, so please welcome Emma.
Thank you to Parsons for having me this afternoon to speak about fashion and technology at MFIT. Again, my name is Emma McClendon. I'm one of the co-curators of the exhibition, which is currently on view and will be up through May 8th for those of you who have not yet been. My co-curator and I, Ariel Alaya, we have been asked multiple times, since the show opened in December, about where we got our inspiration for the show, sort of why now. I think it's safe to say that technology is a very hot topic at the moment, not only in terms of its relation to fashion or even what the latest gadget can do, but in relation to a larger sociocultural issue of how technology is really affecting the way we live our lives. From the way we interact with each other and the world around us, to the way we consume objects, images, ideas, and information. Technology is really transforming the way our reference points and our perspectives as it changes the materials that we create with. For this reason, we wanted to explore technology and how it relates to fashion through a historical lens. Because really, while the term techno-fashion is used today to refer to a predominantly 21st century phenomenon, technology has really had a huge impact on fashion since the Industrial Revolution. So for us, we really wanted to look at how technology has really sort of been interacting with fashion and pushing fashion in new directions over the past 250 years to really sort of gain a greater understanding of the current relationship between fashion and technology. And we really wanted to highlight in the exhibition many things which are now often taken for granted, such as the zipper and also the at-home washing machine, things we use every day but don't really think of as technologically advanced, even though when they were first introduced, they really sort of transformed the industry as we knew it. So I'm going to launch just right into this. So we decided to open the exhibition very consciously with a cross-section of the current state of fashion and technology. We really wanted to frame the entire kind of conversation of the show in the sort of contemporary moment. As you see at the entranceway to the exhibition, we have a video installed that shows the finale of Hussein Chalayan's spring 2007 runway presentation. For this presentation, he showed several garments which seemed to transform by themselves while the model stood on the runway. Here you see 6 photographs that show the transformation of one such ensemble. For these pieces, Chalayan actually collaborated with the people that did the special effects for the Harry Potter films to integrate the garments with sewable electronic components that were controlled offstage via remote. As you see, the garments from the hat to the dress really sort of transform and change shape, and this really sort of shocked the industry. What we see here is really technology being used as a form of artistic expression, not just the sort of material and the hardware, but really a sort of creative component as well. As we move into the first room, we have this piece very prominently on display. This is a very special piece to the museum at FIT. It's a 3D printed dress and matching bag from Dutch design studio Freedom of Creation. And we've got an accompanying video really demonstrating the garment's fabrication from a CAD file on the computer, which you can see there on the screen, through the 3D printing process where lasers actually pass through a container of nylon powder and bond the garment into a seamless object, which comes out sort of at the end. The museum at FIT has a close relationship with Freedom of Creation, and actually in 2003 we acquired one of their experimental textiles and became the first museum to have a 3D printed textile in our collection. So again, sort of thinking about the materials of fashion, here it's important to point out that this 3D printed garment, it's considered a textile, what it's made from. So even though it's not woven, even though it's not knit, even though it doesn't use threads in the traditional sense, it is still considered a textile. And then finally, sort of rounding out this current cross-section, we have a video display of a holographic runway show that Burberry created for the opening of their flagship store in Beijing in April of 2011. What's really special about this particular runway show is not even the fact that they're just holograms and that all the models you see here sort of splash into each other in the middle of the runway and transform garments simultaneously. But what's really important with this video and why we chose to include it is also that as the shots sort of pan out during the course of the video, you can see the audience actually holding up smartphones, recording the performance live. Even before Burberry posted an official video of the holographic runway show to their YouTube channel, all of these people almost instantaneously posted it on YouTube, and the show went viral very quickly. What this represents is another side to how technology is having an impact on fashion, one that goes beyond the materials and the sort of production process, and is a sort of broader kind of marketing strategy, something related to the sort of global positioning of fashion and how we interact with it. Burberry is probably one of the most cutting-edge companies working with social media networks to further their branding strategy. They have their YouTube channel, but then also later on in 2011, they became the first company to launch a fragrance on Facebook. That sounds very counterintuitive, how you launch a fragrance on a website, but essentially it worked that all those users who liked the fragrance, the first 250,000 viewers to like the fragrance, were then sent samples of the fragrance, and that was sort of how it worked. That same month that they did that, Burberry also held the first tweet walk, where they tweeted the looks from their runway presentation seconds before they went down the runway. And actually, interestingly enough, Twitter as a whole had the highest spike in people worldwide watching one Twitter feed at any one time. And so it just shows sort of how fashion and technology together have mutually beneficial sort of uses and applications for their work. The exhibition after this entry room moves forward chronologically, decade by decade, century by century, highlighting different innovations that happened during the period. Rather than take you through this history sort of step by step, I wanted to take this opportunity today to do something a bit different and talk to you about the 4 underlying themes that really run throughout the exhibition, which my co-curator and I used as sort of the primary criteria for selecting objects for the show. Obviously, technology is a vast topic, and its application to fashion is huge as well. So really, in our selection process, it was very important for us to kind of come up with a frame for this. So the 4 themes that we were working with, as you see here, were production, material, aesthetic, and function. Now, the first 2 are fairly straightforward. They deal with what is typically sort of discussed in fashion's relationship with technology, the production being the literal sort of production method of objects of fashion, the material being what these objects are made from. Aesthetic and function go a bit outside the box. They think more abstractly about the sociological applications and sort of impacts of fashion, of technology on fashion, and sort of think about the way fashion objects change how they look and also how they're used by the people that consume them. So with production, as I said, it's much more straightforward than the last 2. And sort of going back to the Industrial Revolution, we have it represented in some objects, some of our earliest objects from the show. Here we have a dress and also a textile behind that were created using a jacquard loom. The jacquard loom was introduced in 1801, and it essentially mechanized the production, the weaving process of very complex patterns. As you see here, prior to the introduction of the jacquard loom, it was a very lengthy, difficult process to create such sort of intricate patterns on a loom. And as a result, textiles of this nature were extremely costly and very sort of in short supply. With the jacquard loom, now all of a sudden you see a sort of democratized consumption of of these fabrics on a much wider scale. But also, interestingly enough, the way the jacquard loom operates are with things called punch cards, which use positive and negative space to tell the loom sort of when to use certain threads. This binary system is really sort of helped pave the way for computer coding, which would come in the next century. And actually, jacquard looms were one of the first industrial machines to be given over to computer operation because of this use of a binary system. Also, sort of the sewing machine is one that always needs to be highlighted. We're all familiar probably with this machine. What's interesting, though, is the sewing machine first introduced in the mid-19th century. What's not necessarily as well known is how quickly it was adopted by dressmakers at every level. Even couturier Charles Frederick Worth was known for using the sewing machine in his atelier in Paris. And what we find is that typically where you see machine stitching at this time is on the interior of garments and not as much on the exterior. So we've included a video monitor, as you see in the installation, to show the interior of the bodice dressed on the mannequin. Oftentimes when you go to shows, you see these historic garments. They're very fragile. You can't display them so you can see their inside. So we've used technology here in the technology show to really show the difference between how these different stitches are being used. The oldest piece in the exhibition is this man's jacket and waistcoat from the 18th century, which was created with a machine knit textile. Knitting machines had been around for centuries, and by the early 18th century, they were really sort of in wide operation in England for creating luxury goods. But what we see as we get into the 20th century is different designers playing around with this technology and really pushing it forward in new directions. And so Missoni, very famously in the mid-20th century, began experimenting and used what's known as a Rochelle machine to create their now distinctive zigzag patterns. And what we see here is before you get Missoni's innovation, knitwear really could only use colors in sort of vertical, horizontal, linear stripes. And with the introduction of these zigzags, you now get a greater variety of tone. Diana Vreeland was a huge fan of this process and was very outspoken on how sort of innovative it was to get this variety of colors. Then as we sort of move forward into the 20th century, with the introduction of synthetic materials and plastics, we have the use of heat setting, really sort of taking fashion in new directions. And so we have this fascinating garment by Pierre Cardin from the 1960s, where he's using a material called dynel, which could be molded using heat into these, as you see, beautiful volumetric shapes that decorate the skirt and top of the dress. Interestingly enough, though, the entire dress is actually molded as well. It's made from a single piece of dynel material, and though there are darts that are added afterwards to give sort of better fit to the wearer, the entire piece is actually made from a single piece of dynel that has then been molded to the wearer's body. As we move forward into the later 20th century, we have Japanese designers, particularly Issey Miyake, experimenting with a lot of textile combinations. And here we have him using a linen that has then been coated in a synthetic material and using heat set to achieve much subtler pleats across it. So rather than the very sort of sharp protrusions of the Cardin piece, we now see, as we move forward, the combination of natural and synthetic materials gives a greater range of capabilities in the effects designers are able to achieve. Similarly, as we move even forward, Hishinuma, who worked much with Issey Miyake in the earlier part of his career, is very well known for his experiments with textiles as well. And here we see him working with polyester that has been coated with polyurethane in different points. And then heat is being used to shrink the polyester into these jagged, angular shapes that create this very beautiful abstract shapes around the body. And then finally, we end up in this production period with freedom of creation. And obviously, I mentioned it is 3D printed. You see in the up-close sort of detail shot on the right that the material that they're using with this nylon powder ends up quite brittle, at least in these early stages in 2005 when this garment was produced. This is a huge sort of hindering block to the sort of evolution of 3D printing. This issue of the materials that are being used and what they feel like on the wearer's body after the fact, how they move. And since 2005, when this particular piece was created, designers and engineers and scientists have been working together to try to devise, more advanced sort of variety of feels in terms of softness and elasticity. In the latest couture shows that just happened in Paris, designer Iris van Herpen premiered these two looks in her couture collection. And what we see here is for these pieces, Iris van Herpen was working with MIT professors and 3D printing companies to try to achieve sort of more advanced textiles out of 3D printers. And we see here with these two garments, the sort of textured piece on the left, and then on the right, how she's able to now mimic lace as we've gotten to a more advanced stage of this technology. Also, what's interesting with Iris van Herpen is these are couture pieces, and obviously in the process of couture, one is supposed to use a fair amount of hand craftsmanship. Iris van Herpen is very outspoken on her view that coding, computer coding, and the intricacies of that are, in a way, can be sort of thought as a sort of tech replacement for the sort of intricate hand needlepoint and embroidery of traditional couture as we move further into the 21st century. So I think that that's an interesting way of thinking about technology as it relates to hand craftsmanship, this sort of, craftsmanship of the code, in a way. But then as we move forward, material is another very sort of, point that needs to be mentioned in fashion and technology. And we have here one of the earliest examples of it. This is an afternoon dress from 1860 that uses aniline dye in its production. Aniline dye was the first as a synthetic dye created through chemical process. The first aniline dye was this color purple. It was invented by a chemist in the UK who actually discovered it by accident while he was looking for a cure for malaria. Working in the lab, there was a sort of powdery residue in his workstation that then sort of got on his clothing and dyed it this sort of vibrant specks of purple. Purple at this time was a much sought after color. The process of getting purple, obviously dyes before you have aniline dyes are all sort of derived from natural sources, plants, animals, what have you. Purple was incredibly difficult to produce, particularly in large quantities, and it faded very, very quickly. As you see here from this photo taken in 2012 of this dress from 1860, these aniline dyes are fade resistant. They're also much more cost effective to produce. So as a result, you have really a sort of democratization of the color purple. No longer with the introduction of these synthetic dyes, it's attainable by not just members of the clergy and royalty to consume and wear. As we get sort of into the 1920s and 1930s, I think it's important to point out the use of plastic in these periods because it's often forgotten. We think of the 1960s as being the era of plastic, but really here we see as early as the 1920s, designers were using gelatin to replace as sort of precursors to modern plastic. Obviously, we sort of consume gelatin, and as we know from sort of its use in food products, that when you expose gelatin to moisture, it swells, it dissolves. So it's interesting when we look at these 1920s evening dresses covered in cellophane sequins, it's interesting to think about the fact that when the wearers would wear these dresses out on the town while they were dancing, as soon as they started to sweat, their dresses actually began to dissolve on them. So it was not the most sustainable of embellishments. So you saw people sort of trying to develop and use different types of plastic, and you get cellophane very quickly adapted to the fashion industry as you get into the 1930s. And actually, the suit on the left is knit with wool and a cellophane slit film, which is really sort of shocking to see, given how we don't really think of the 30s as being sort of an era of plastic. And then just to sort of show as a little anecdote, we have this photograph in the exhibition as well. It's Cecil Beaton's sister in 1929, and she's wearing almost entirely cellophane ball gown that Cecil Beaton helped design for her to wear to the Galaxy Ball as a shooting star in London. But then as we get into the later 20th century, really the sort of use of synthetic materials gets much more widespread. Here we have a man's suit from the 1950s that uses nylon. Nylon was sort of cutting edge material at this time, really sort of lauded for its quick drying properties. And you can see the sort of exaggerated advertisement in the screen just next to the suit of a British advertisement showing how these suits were so quick drying that you could actually just take a bath in them, shower in them in the morning, and then by the time you walk out on the street, you are fully dry again. So obviously an exaggeration, and I doubt very many people tried this, but it just goes to show that these things, while nowadays we wouldn't necessarily want an entirely nylon suit or even think to advertise it on television, at the time, these materials were so exciting that they were being used by even high-end designers. As we get into the 80s, it's important to mention the sort of evolution of stretch and lycra in design, because we so often now see in sort of fabric contents of our clothing that it'll be 90% this, and 2% elasticine. It's so common now sort of in fast fashion to try to achieve a fit by giving just a tiny bit of stretch. This innovation was actually thanks to a designer who's much forgotten now, Marc Audebay, a French ready-to-wear designer who in the 80s actually approached tech company DuPont to try to devise a way to take lycra and combine it with cotton, with silk, with linen to create a sort of, new, very sort of futuristic high-end material. And he was able to achieve that in what he called his bi-stretch material. And you see that in this beautiful dress with the long train in the back, and also an advertisement from the 80s showing sort of the stretch capabilities of these materials. As we get into the 21st century, though, we start to see the materials of fashion evolve to incorporate electronics. And so we have this Luminex textile that is actually woven using fiber optics with then LED lights at the end. So as you see in the shirt, the fiber optics give a much more sort of subtle iridescent than sort of the all-over LEDs we sometimes see in tech fashion. And then as we sort of just to mention developing projects that are still very much sort of in prototype form, Suzanne Lee, working in London, is developing her project called BioCouture, in which you actually are able to grow a leather substitute from a green tea solution, which produces bacteria-produced cellulose. So you see here how she's able to create this jacket from the dried form of this material. And then here we actually have a video that shows the sort of wet substance as it comes out as she's sort of growing it in her home. What's interesting is you can then take the wet material and actually mold it into three-dimensional forms on the body before it dries to create a seamless garment as well. But now sort of moving into the less sort of straightforward pieces, I think it's important to sort of think about the broader ramifications of technology on the world around us, both in terms of how the world looks and how we use different objects in our lives. For the aesthetic and sort of function themes that Ariel and I looked at, it's important to realize, though, that many of these objects are not technologically advanced, so they wouldn't necessarily end up in any other tech show. They don't light up, they don't have, sort of crazy different properties, all of them necessarily, but that makes them no less important. For example, this jacket here from the 1920s is made from a silk crepe. It's not, technologically advanced in how it's produced in any way, but the engineered print across it really represents a visual shift that happened in the early 20th century. Now that you have sort of motor cars on the streets, skyscrapers rising in cities, early air travel, the pace of life is rapidly changing as a result of technology in the 20th century. And really, this was shown very sort of drastically in the Art Deco movement, which developed a sort of heavily geometric visual vocabulary to express these technological changes in art and design. And this really sort of crossed over into fashion, as you see on the jacket, and also the textile behind as decorative motifs, which were very important to fashion during this period. In the 1960s, the space race was a huge cultural reference and influence at the time, though one not necessarily directly connected to fashion. That doesn't mean, though, that it didn't have its effects on fashion. As we see here in the paper dress on the right, the image of a rocket launch quite literally being used as a decorative element in the design. And then on the left, we have an ensemble by couturier André Courrèges. During the 1960s, though it seems sort of ridiculous to us now, it seemed very logical to people that you give it 10, you give it 20 years, we will be vacationing on the moon. That seems absurd to us now, but if you think about the fact that by the start of the decade, you have the first men orbiting the Earth, by the end of the decade, you have the first men landing on the moon, and this is a period when 10, 20 years before, commercial air travel wasn't readily available to everyone. So it seemed that these huge leaps and bounds in technology would just continue. And so what you have are couturiers like André Courrèges developing what they sort of thought the fashionable woman would wear when she went to outer space, sort of tapping into these images of astronauts and different sort of, technologies at the time to create this kind of utilitarian, galactical fashion for the future. Similarly, we have this piece by Simon Thorogood. Simon Thorogood is another designer who's not necessarily readily known today. He's not such a household name anymore. But he was designing, working in London at the turn of the 21st century, and he was showing his work primarily in gallery spaces to a large degree. And what he wanted to do was really create a fashion for the future, something that didn't reference anything that came before it, but still something that was firmly rooted in traditional fashion techniques. So he was using materials like Duchess satin and couture sort of handcrafting techniques. But then to create this future fashion, he was looking at technology as his aesthetic inspiration, particularly pilotless drones, so military aircraft being developed at this time. This particular piece is called the dam dress. His dam dress, the term dam is actually a part of a fuselage in a drone. His sort of dedication to taking elements from drones was almost obsessive. He matched the color of this dress exactly to that of drones. And also the different shapes you see across the piece are derived from the shapes of parts of the wings, the body of the plane, and so on and so forth. What's interesting, though, with this piece is that many people we brought through the exhibition immediately think of designers like Rick Owens when they see this piece. Some of his most recent collections, the sort of overall shape and color and tone of the piece. But it just goes to show that sometimes these technological advanced designers are maybe a bit too ahead of their time. So they aren't necessarily as successful in their day and age, but you see their influence later on. And then we end up with, on sort of going to the most recent collections, this Autumn-Winter 2012 piece by up-and-coming London-based designer Louise Gray. Louise Gray has her background in textile design, textile arts, and so textiles are really a sort of central thing for her in her collections. And as you see here, for this collection, she was looking at the aesthetic of the QR code. So the QR code, an example is on the right, is sort of the digital update to the barcode. It can be scanned by smartphones and give you a whole variety of information, images, videos, making it a sort of ideal marketing tool for the digital age. You see in the piece, though, how Louise Gray has taken the sort of visual elements of this technological device and sort of rendered it on the piece. And interestingly enough, the QR code on the right is actually the invitation for Louise Gray's runway show. So she actually sort of took it a step further and had this scannable barcode as the way people learned where her collection was actually being shown, sort of what time, the date, so on and so forth. Then we move on into function. This one is one that people sort of, when we mention these themes, are a bit sort of, intrigued by the different examples we can come up with. These two pieces are probably one of my favorite that we've included in the exhibition because of this function element. The piece on the left is a duster from the early 20th century designed to be worn in early motor cars, which offered no covering. So when driving, at the high speed of 30 miles an hour on unpaved roads, you would get covered in dirt and dust if you were not wearing one of these. Similarly, the piece on the right is a bicycling ensemble from the late 19th century. It looks like a long skirt. It is not. It is what's called a bifurcated skirt or a divided skirt. It is actually pants that are designed to look like a full-length skirt when a woman is standing. So what we see here are two examples, one in linen, one in wool. Neither is a techno object, but both exist solely because of technology. And they're designed to help the wearer sort of function with technological devices. And each in turn have had an influence on later fashion design, sort of enabling women, sort of helping women to, wear pants early on, sort of everyone getting used to that aesthetic. And then also the duster sort of having great influence on outerwear as we get into the 20th century. And then just to sort of illustrate the use of these and sort of their appearance in fashion as well, we have this fashion illustration from La Mode from 1903, which shows a woman in a bifurcated skirt bicycling ensemble, and also a woman in her fashionable duster in the back in her motor car. But then, sort of as we get into the 21st century, we do get more sort of techno-advanced functional objects, sort of changing the way fashion is sort of working in our daily lives. We have this piece, which is a jacket by Infineon Technologies, which is wired to function as an MP3 player, quite literally, not just to sort of be able to plug your MP3 player in, but as you see on the left-hand arm, there is an actual control panel on the jacket that has sort of skip, pause, play functions on it, and then the earbuds coming up from the collar. So it is a jacket, but it is also an MP3 player. Similarly, we have this piece here. It's Vivienne Tam's Digital Clutch, which she premiered in spring 2010 on her runway show. She collaborated with HP to create these. And as you see, they are laptops. They are computers, but they are marketed and designed to function as an accessory, sort of technology as accessory now. And actually, when you purchase one of these pieces, they come the way a sort of high-end handbag would, in a box with a sort of dust cover. They're not at all presented the way we consume other technological devices. They are very much of fashion and of the sort of accessory realm. But then sort of a bit different, we have here the LilyPad Arduino microcontroller board. This is the smallest piece in the exhibition. And what this is really the building blocks of techno fashion, sort of as most of us sort of think of it. It is, as you see with the thread coming up on the left-hand side, a sewable computer brain, essentially, a microcontroller board. It can get plugged into a computer and programmed to perform a variety of functions when sort of hooked up to all of these conductive threads. One example that the creator of this, Dr. Leah Buckley of MIT, shows as sort of a prime example of its application is this signaling jacket for bike riders. She has, as you see, placed the LilyPad rather prominently in the back, and then there are two LED turn signals on the sides with buttons at the cuffs of the sleeves. You can, with the help of the LilyPad being programmed, hit the buttons on either cuff and signal which way you're turning. You can touch them at the same time, and they will create hazard lights as well. This is just a very sort of simple example of what the LilyPad can do. A more advanced example is this example here by Diffuse, Danish design company, which uses the LilyPad, as you see on the right, in what is called their climate dress. The LilyPad here has been programmed to light up the LEDs on the dress in direct relation to the amount of CO2 it senses in the air around it. So it is quite literally a pollution sensing dress. And it changes, as you see, they debuted it with a model walking through an urban space to sort of show how when she went down into a subway, went onto the street, how the different levels changed. So the LilyPad is something very advanced, But what's fascinating about it is it's designed to be a do-it-yourself technology. You can buy it, you and I can buy it individually for about the price of $15 from SparkFun Electronics, with all the different components to make our technologically wired garment. All of the sort of do-it-yourself instructions are online to sort of teach you the bare bones of how to code. All of this sort of shows something that Ariel and I discovered, which we found quite interesting, about the direction technology and tech developers are kind of moving now. And that seems to be a much more sort of do-it-yourself, learn how technology actually works approach, rather than sort of having the latest gadgets come out from huge companies and have us just blindly consume them and learn how to use them. Professors at MIT and others are really sort of adamant about us learning how technology actually works and getting comfortable with working with it ourselves, sort of learning all of these different applications and really sort of getting our hands onto these devices. And the LilyPad is really probably the best example because it's something that I'm sure we all see and are immediately daunted by. It's something that seems so far outside of our grasp. But really, when you look at these things online, and I sort of encourage you guys all too, they look like recipes. These sort of do-it-yourself guidelines. They have sort of all the different components listed and very sort of simple to follow directions. And it's just sort of interesting to sort of see where this kind of tech evolution is going in this way, to the point where maybe we can sort of create pieces that solve local, create local pieces to solve local problems. So in conclusion, if you guys have a chance to go and see the exhibition, you will see that we ended the exhibition with a video that shows many different prototype projects that are being developed today. One of which, is the LilyPad, another is the BioCouture that I showed you today. And the reason we wanted to end this way is because fashion and technology are continually evolving. They're not, showing no signs of stopping. And we wanted to end it on an open note, sort of continue the discourse and people sort of thinking about where we could go, because it's unclear at this point what exactly is going to be the next big thing. But one thing's for sure, it's all sort of a product of a lot of collaboration between fashion designers and also engineers and scientists alike. I think that that's an important thing to think about as well. The panel before us sort of mentioned the sort of excitement of students learning how things are actually made, and all of these different technological devices that all of these different companies were using. I think that sometimes we forget in the fervor of all these, sort of beautiful objects and creativity, that there is, a heavy engineering, scientific side to fashion as well. And I think it's important to sort of remember that going forward and explore that as well. So I'll end the talk there. We might be a little bit early. I don't really know what time it is exactly. Yes. So I guess maybe we'll take questions. I don't know if that's designed. Hi, Fiona. Yeah, we can do a Q&A. That's fine.
Hi.
Yeah.
You've shown like a bazillion different interesting ways that fashion and technology interact, including some ones for the future. From your opinion and from putting this exhibition together, what do you think is the most commercially viable in the same way that something like nylon would have been compared to, say, paper dresses? Which do you think for the future will be the most commercially viable, or the one that's most likely to be introduced into mass production?
I think one thing to really watch that is sort of moving forward in leaps and bounds and getting a lot of attention at the moment is 3D printing. I don't know, it's still very expensive, which is a problem for it. And as I mentioned, the materials that are being used for it are very complex and pose certain issues in terms of fit and whatnot. But I think that it's something that people are really interested in. And so people are putting a lot of money and a lot of time and effort into figuring out ways to actually use this, because I think the broader applications, if we're able to print garments, and this isn't necessarily meaning that you and I will have a 3D printer at home and make our own things and print them, But I think in terms of fashion history, one thing that's always pointed out as sort of a mild shortcoming of fashion is the fact that as advanced as we get, as global as we get, as sort of, ethical, in our considerations we get, there's still the issue of the need for the sewing machine. And there's still the issue of the need of, most often a woman, most often in a third world country, working at a sewing machine to produce a garment. And I think that 3D printing is really interesting, and people are looking at it in a lot of ways, because even if it's very expensive, that you could get to the point where maybe, larger companies invest in it and begin to produce their garments that way, which would move away from that sort of manual labor aspect. So I think that that's one to definitely watch. Any other questions?
Any questions? Hold on. Run over.
I'm just interested in the point of 3D printing. What do you think, if we go further, if 3D printing will change the fashion industry and the rights in fashion industry as it's changed in music industry with the MP3 players and stuff? What about that point? What about consequences?
Yeah, I think that there is, technology has posed huge issues to the issue of intellectual property and copying and all of that. And I think, 3D printing will not necessarily negate that. I think that certain companies are figuring out ways, though, to try to get around the issue of sort of technology, sort of harness technology's capabilities in a positive sense, because, there's always been copies, and there's sort of, ideally there wouldn't be, and there'd be a way to get rid of them. But at the moment, it seems as if fast fashion and copying is something that exists, and we need to figure out a way to sort of have legal action to prevent it. But in terms of technology, people are always going to have a way to sort of...
It's not just a copy, I think. Mm-hmm. We will not sell dress anymore. We will sell programs.
Well, I think you'll always have the sort of finished object. I think that in that way, you will still be selling dresses and you'll still be selling garments. I think also, no matter how far 3D printing goes, I think we're a very long way off, if it ever happens, of having it entirely replace, the production of fashion. I think that, people will always be interested in that kind of handcrafted aspect as well at different sort of levels of production. So even if there are, many applications of 3D printing, I think that there will also be people still working with the sort of traditions of hand craftsmanship as well.
Yeah, I was actually kind of wondering, do you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah.
About the nanotechnology. That wasn't really included in the presentation, but what do you think about that?
In what sense?
Nanotechnology integrated in fashion, in garments, and textiles, as it is becoming a very important technology, actually. And I think you can integrate it in textiles as well, for example, with a touch or anything included.
Yeah, I think that it is a very sort of interesting aspect. With this exhibition, a reason it might not have been included is because for this exhibition, criteria for us was that we had to include pieces from the museum at FIT's collection. So there, nanotechnology is a huge sort of very interesting aspect of sort of where fashion and technology are going. But in our collection at the museum, we sort of don't have a piece that necessarily highlights it as much as we sort of would have wanted to include. But it is a very sort of important aspect of it.
Yeah, so you're not really working on that or very busy with it?
No, we haven't sort of included that in the show, but it is a very sort of important development.
Yeah. All right.
I really appreciated how broadly you're thinking about fashion and technology. It was great to see that. And I wanted you to comment on design education. And in fields like graphic design, it's now assumed that everybody has a technological fluency, whereas in fashion and technology tends to still be its own track or niche or series of courses that students can take. How far do you think we are from really embedding technology as a requirement throughout all of the fashion design education courses?
I mean, I think it depends on the institution. I think it is really important for designers at all levels, particularly now that we're using things like CAD so much in the design process, that computers are, and I think people are very aware of this, a very important part of the design process, and people are integrating it more than 10, 20 years ago into the discussion. I think the sort of high-level coding and all of that is something that is more dependent on the institution, and I think that it's still in a stage where, because the applications in the mainstream industry and what's being sold are not as sort of widespread, that people have yet to sort of do it on a wide scale. But I think there is interest among students. I think increasingly more so every year there is interest among people to have, these coding aspects and different things in their courses. Oh yeah, Ariel, do you have a question?
Well, I can kind of add on to that.
There you go.
With that, I mean, even at FIT, and I'm sure Parsons is starting to experiment with it, we have a 3D printer at FIT, and it's interesting for the animation students, fashion design, also the shoe and accessory design, that they're starting to make prototype shoes and things. So I think it's definitely starting to be integrated and experimented with. And I think, there's tons of CAD classes and things like that. So I think sooner or later, pretty much, I would say most people will need to learn it. And even with, I think, some fashion designers, a lot of the collaborations with younger students and trying to get the technological aspects to it. So even if maybe a designer really specializes in sketching, they might have an assistant or someone transfer it to more of a digital file of it.
So I have a short question, like something like slightly different, but still the boundary of the fashion. Like last weekend, I joined a very interesting event called Fashion Hackathon. It was like a combination word between hack and marathon. So that was like kind of competition to solve some of the wicked, like serious issue in fashion industry. And then they were talking about like how we're gonna address like different issue, like such as like communication issue in fashion industry. How we're gonna minimize this cost to make a sample in China and then ship back to New York City and then ship back to China to, all this like messy communication. But like I haven't seen any like that kind of, procedural aspect of fashion other than this product or manufacturing. So like, do you think like that kind of address, like where is the potential in technology and the relationship between technology and the process part of fashion, not just about the, the manufacturing and product part?
Well, I think that there are aspects. I know that fashion companies now, with their barcodes and with different applications, actually have the ability to track objects as they go across the world. And I think that with the hackathon, with developing these different apps for the fashion industry, that there are many different sort of fields where you can sort of bring the two together. And I think that the industrial side of it is something where technology can really kind of bring in. For these, since our study was kind of object-based, we were really looking at the objects themselves. But obviously in the broader sort of business scheme of things and how the industry itself runs, there's huge applications for technology there. Yeah, exactly. Any other? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It's been so enlightening in so many ways. That systematic approach to production, material, aesthetics, function. Regarding production, for example, I wanted to ask you about if you are taking care of in your exhibition or in your work or in your research about the ultimate social implications and outcomes of this ongoing revolution. I don't know if you have made some space maybe for the washing machine in your exhibition.
If you come to the exhibition, actually, we do have a piece on view by Claire McCardle from the 1950s, sort of when the washing machine kind of became a fixture of the modern suburban home. That's one of the pieces that we were so happy to include in the show, because obviously the washing machine is something we all use all the time. We don't think of, really necessarily in our study and consideration of fashion, think about a period when it didn't exist and what that must have been like. But we have a piece in our collection by Claire McCardle, which was actually featured in an advertisement in 1956 for a Philco washing machine. Claire McCardle was quite outspoken in her interest in creating washable garments for the sort of suburban woman. And so she actually was sort of brought on by Philips and Philco and all of these companies to sort of really promote their latest washing machine devices. So we have sort of pictures and images in the exhibition that highlight that as well.
Thank you very much. Sorry, and in that way, do you foresee, what's your opinion about do you foresee any new way of social interaction, social collectivism, social sharing spirit in our society coming out of these innovations?
Well, I think, I think in terms of sort of the sociological side, I think social media, social networking sites are, having a massive sort of impact on the fashion industry as a whole, from sort of the way Burberry's using things to sort of share videos, share collections, share images, but then also sort of with online consumption of clothing as well. Sort of with e-commerce is a huge scope of sort of how all of these things are sort of changing the sort of social position of fashion and how we interact with it. Any other questions? Do you guys want to eat? Probably. I'll hand it back over to Fiona then, for a weather update, I presume.
Thank you so much.
No problem.